I want to thank Emma and Donald also for the initial invitation to come, and the Institute for very kindly hosting me for this. What I want to do today is to speak a little bit about, I'm taking some stuff from another new book that comes out also next year called The New Treason of the Intellectuals, which is essentially a revisiting of some of the ideas that Julien Benda in 1927 came up with in his famous tract La Treason des Clercs, which he republished in 1946, just after the war. It's kind of always interested me that in 1946 in Europe there are a whole series of new and republished books, including La Treason des Clercs, but also Der Idee der Universität by Karl Jaspers, who is rewriting the idea of the university essentially for a post-Nazi world. One of the arguments that I've been trying to make over the last few years is that we do live certainly in a post-Nazi world, but it's a post-Nazi world as well. That's to say, a lot of the ideas that are shaping us, a lot of the politics that are shaping us, are still conditioned by a reaction against Nazism, which means that they're still shaped by a mentality that's governed by a Nazi ideology. And some of that will come up today, but not too much. I want today to speak more about a slightly more general idea of neoliberalism and how it has affected and afflicted the university in general and the humanities, I suppose, in particular within that. I'll begin with a kind of odd idea. Just imagine that you had the power, freedom, and responsibility to organize an entire people into some kind of social, political, ethical, cultural arrangement. Well, where would you begin? Almost certainly you'd not begin by suggesting that the first thing we'd need in this institution is a university. Certainly not anything like a contemporary university. If you were starting to, as it were, imagine the perfect society, the perfect polity, you almost certainly wouldn't begin by thinking, what we really need is something like UCD, or something like Trinity, even worse, or something like Warwick, worse still. I have a deep affection for all these places, even including Warwick, which tried to fire me. Plato, of course, thought about all this, and in the Republic he started his consideration of civic and social life with a very different question. He began with the question of justice. He said that in any kind of society, you'd want something that was going to be just. That seems to be a kind of sine qua non, that's where you would begin. So he begins pondering the idea of justice, and as soon as he explores that idea of justice, that he begins to think, well, how would you begin to legitimize just judgments? And it's then that he makes the shift in books 2 and 3, if you remember the Republic, he makes the shift directly to education as such. And book 2 closes with the question of how to adjudicate or discriminate between good and bad in general. And he then extends that to ask whether the issue of education as such will help us at all in our main inquiry, as he puts it, into the origin of justice and injustice. Now, although if we were going to try to begin to imagine some kind of great society, it's unlikely that we'd begin with a consideration of the university. It remains nonetheless a fairly safe bet that some form of education would be envisaged fairly early on as a necessity and even as an absolute priority in our thinking. So before thinking about your design of this great institution, this great society, you'd presumably want to have some kind of knowledge or even foreknowledge of possible outcomes, possible consequences of whatever it is that you plan to do. You'd probably hypothesize some general idea of a social arrangement regarding, for example, a system of laws, a kind of regulatory system that we would all subscribe to in one way or another, and then try to envisage how the particularities of that system might fit an overall scheme of things, including, as in Plato, questions of physical health and general well-being, as it's called in contemporary economics. But in a word, in doing all that, you'd be doing some research as the very foundation of your work. That's the first thing you'd do. You'd be doing some research. You'd also find yourself thereby centrally impelled to engage with whatever it is that passes in your time as the prevailing conditions of knowledge as such. Insofar as your thinking impinges upon material realities at all, that's to say upon real conditions of human and other ecological existence, insofar as your thinking impinges upon those kind of material realities, you must begin from some conviction that there are some conceptual ideas that you've got in mind that seem to fit the material facts of the world, while other ideas constitute obvious falsehoods or lies. In our time, for example, we know it's an obvious falsehood that the moon is made of cheese. The moon is not made of cheese, we know that. Some of us have even stood on the moon, but we haven't stood on it the way you would stand on a lump of cheese. It hasn't, as it were, given way under your feet. We know from the empirical evidence. In other words, you begin to adjudicate between what constitutes truth and falsehood. I'll come back to that later on, because of course that's one of the things that is now kind of in abeyance in our time. But you'd begin from a conviction that some conceptual ideas fit the material facts and others don't. And you'd have to test and therefore come to know which is which, what is the true and what is the false. Plato gives the model of a watchdog who can discriminate or judge between who is friend and who is foe. When somebody approaches the camp, the watchdog thinks this is a friend and therefore wags its tail, or thinks this is an enemy and starts barking. And what the dog is doing there, according to Plato, is making a shift from a kind of visceral, sensual depiction of the world. It smells this enemy, doesn't recognise it and thinks that's an enemy, I will therefore bark, ruff, ruff, ruff. Or it thinks, smell that, sounds good, yeah, it smells really tasty, I know her, that's, yeah, so it wags its tail and thinks, yeah, I'll lick that as soon as it arrives. And what you get there is something whereby a conceptual idea rests on an empirical bit of evidence. So your ideas are derived from the empirical facts of the case, as it were. What we'd be doing is, I guess, beginning to use empirical evidence, what it is that constitutes the true as opposed to the false, in order to work out what might constitute friendship, solidarity, neighbourliness, love, all those kinds of things that we hope are going to govern our being together. Okay, so much for that kind of ostensible side issue. In fact, it's a fairly central issue, as I'm going to try to show, because three possible outcomes, I think, follow from this. First, if your initial hypothesis turns out to be ideal and good, then you might claim to know something. You might claim some knowledge. But more importantly, you'll be able to prove your knowledge by legitimising the idea against the material facts of the case. Second, if your initial hypothesis turns out to be wanting in some respect, then you're engaged in a process called learning. You now know more than you did before, and more importantly, you know something different from what passed as the state of your knowledge in the first place. So you've done some research, you've done some legitimisation of an idea, and you've done some learning here. And importantly, in all of these things, an element of difference has crept in. You've begun to think things differently from how you did before. Third, you'd have to realise that either or both of those two previous outcomes are also subject to further possible change, because you were fairly sure of where you stood before you learnt something new. You know, I mean, back pre-Copernicus, it's not the case that people were wandering around thinking, oh Christ, I wish Copernicus could come along and just correct this error that we're all kind of wandering around in. We're all here thinking that the Earth is at the centre of the universe. And if only somebody would come along and just tell us we're wrong. No, they knew that the Earth was at the centre of the universe. That was true. It was not that was false at all, not by any stretch of the imagination. Everyone knew that it was true. It's just that they learned something different that allowed them to reconceptualise, rethink, and reconfigure the entire world. And that's important. It's called learning. Now, it would be a mistake for us to imagine that somehow, everything's been progressing kind of in a Whiggish fashion towards some state of perfection, the state that we're now in. As Michel Serres famously puts it, you're wandering along and then, ouf, nous sommes enfin entrés dans le vrai. Suddenly, we've entered into truth. Thank God we live here and now. Because, if we were living a century ago, we'd be wandering around thinking, God, I wish an explorer would come and tell us that the world was different from what we think it is. In fact, what you're getting there is a realisation that truth itself is historically located. That does not mean to say that truth is relative. It does not mean to say you're giving up on truth. It means to say that truth has a dynamic relationship to knowledge and, importantly, to learning. One of our problems is that the so-called neoliberal agenda believes, or believed, at least in the late 1980s, early 1990s, they believed that, ouf, nous sommes enfin entrés dans le vrai. As Fukuyama put it, we're at the end of history, we're at the end of ideology, revisiting Daniel Bell from the 1970s. We've finally found the perfect and ideal society. So in all of these things, realising that things might change, you're realizing that there is a relation at stake here between consciousness and history. A relation between how it is you think the world and what the material facts of the world actually are. And these things are in a constant dynamic, constant dialectic, if you will, they're therefore constantly changing. In all of this, what you're getting is I said it's a relationship between consciousness and history. Let me put that in institutional terms. It's a relationship between the institution that governs consciousness, that's to say, the educational apparatus, including the university, and the material conditions of the world, the polity. So fundamentally what we're about here is the relation between the university and the polity, consciousness and history. I'll come back to that again also later. So no matter what the outcome of all your initial propositions, you would nearly always return by necessity to Plato's first question, which concerns the search for what he called a just judgment, for justice itself as such. Plato called that a principle of proper discrimination between the good and the bad. The word that we usually use for that, I think, is criticism. To judge justly is to implement a mode of critical thinking. But criticism presupposes also the desire to persuade somebody other than yourself of the validity of your own proposals for the ideal society. It's what I'm doing right now. I'm trying to persuade you that I've got it right, at least for the moment. But logically, the plan that you have, the plan that I have, must be subject to engagement, like this, and cross-fertilization with other rival proposals. You know, when you attack me, as it were, or when you're sitting there thinking, that's daft what he's talking about. You know, once you begin to engage in that kind of way, you're getting, as it were, rival proposals coming to contest mine. And that presupposes that there's a dialogue among multiple voices and persons. In the act of attempting to persuade others about the preferred validity of one proposal over another, you're engaged in teaching. A little side issue. When Warwick University did try to fire me about 3 years ago, one of the letters I got from the lawyers pointed out that one of the reasons why they had to fire me was, quote, that I was having too much of an influence. And I kind of said, but I'm a teacher, is that not what I'm supposed to do? And they said, no, not that type of influence. And that comes to the nub of what I'm going to be talking about today. There are only certain kinds of things that the institution will regard as legitimate, only certain kinds of things that they will regard as valuable. The reality of what we're trying to do, which is maybe to influence people how to change the world, you know, they were concerned that the students who were in occupation, that I'd somehow, I mean, although I went into occupation with them, I was not the ringleader of it. I'm too old, you know. As I explained to them, don't ask me to stay in the tent overnight, you know. I mean, I'll be there during the day, but for Christ's sake, look at me, my skin's like parchment, you know. If you light a fire, I'll go up. Yeah, so let me go home at night and I'll come back and bring you all a croissant in the morning. This being Warwick, they wanted croissant and pain chocolat and so on. I think it can now be seen that the process of research, learning and teaching are all indeed fundamental to any sentient construction and arrangement of a social order. Insofar as we're conscious at all, our consciousness is formed according to some guiding and motivating drivers. And the very condition of our consciousness is structured by education in and through a search for principles of judgment, and thus also a search for the grounds of justice. That education has to take place in a respectful debate or dialogue over certain points of view, differing points of view, which we might see as a search for a kind of more democratic form of interpersonal relations. And education in the quest to realise as much of our human possibilities as possible is fundamentally what we're about. We're about really trying to extend the range of our human possibilities, it seems to me. Another word for that is freedom. I'll come back to those questions, justice, democracy and freedom, right at the end, I hope. Okay, so let me leave that aside and move on to the conditions of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a word that is used all the time these days. It's a bit like ideology. It can mean all sorts of things and can mean nothing. I want to try to define it fairly closely here and fairly narrowly, in fact. And I'll follow a little bit of what David Harvey, the Marxist geographer, does in his definition of neoliberalism. He says that those who believe in neoliberalism believe that, and I'm quoting him here, individual liberty and freedom are the high point of civilization. Okay? That seems fair enough. But the neoliberal then goes on to argue that individual liberty and freedom can best be protected and achieved, says Harvey, by an institutional structure. Again, fair enough. Made up, he says, of strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. And at that point you think, whoa, that's a very precise definition of what these institutions are going to be. The institutional structure made up of strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. A world in which individual initiative can flourish. The implication of this, says Harvey, is that for the neoliberal, is that the state should not be involved in the economy too much. And who could object to that? That seems, again, for a wild-eyed Trotskyite like myself, or a lefty, that seems, again, fairly reasonable. But the state should use its power to preserve private property rights and the institutions of the market, and to promote those on the global stage if necessary. Now, it's all that last bit that seems to me to be contentious, and obviously I'm going to take issue with it here. There are, I think, probably three driving forces that shape neoliberalism as an economic model, and each of them yield a corresponding ideological view or norm. First up is the idea of the deregulation of economies, especially internal national economies. Such deregulation means that money and financial institutions are less constrained by laws and rules around which the rest of society and human activities operate. So first of all, you've got something that separates the realm of finance from everything else, first of all, and says that finance should be deregulated. It should have as much free play as possible in a society. Secondly, is the idea of the liberalisation, as it's called, of trade, both between nations but also within nations, such that, and this is the ideological component here, such that trading and exchange become the marker not just of all meaningful action, but also the marker of liberality and indeed of freedom itself. With this, freedom is revealed and measured by the extent of our commercial activities only, and things exist only as they are bought and sold. This moves on to include things that are not in the first instance commodities, things like love or health or education. As we all know, we make investments in these things now. Will I invest my libidinal economy in this individual? Is it worth it? Will I take a risk? What will she or he say if I say, I love you? Will I get an I love you more in return? Or, and even better, I loved you first. I was about to say that. In that state of affairs, what you're doing is inserting an erotic relation into an economy. We do it also with health. We do it also now, obviously, with education, with learning. In all of this thing, freedom is reduced to one simple thing: choice. The belief that choice is somehow the marker of all freedom. But choice within a market that has very strictly delimited the number of choices that you can have. And the third driving force, I think, here is the acceptance that all markets are global before they are local, and that therefore our own local values must of necessity be superseded by conditions that are beyond anybody's individual local control. That globalization means that no single individual is in control of her or his destiny, because the global system overrides the possibility of any kind of local control, and you end up with what Hannah Arendt famously described as potentially the most cruel form of political system, bureaucracy. Or as she puts it, rule by the offices, which is what bureaucracy means, or fundamentally, as she puts it, rule by no one. In a bureaucracy, as you know, and we all live in one now, and we all work in one, in a bureaucracy, nobody is ever to blame for what is going wrong. Bureaucracies are structured around what you can call the delegation of blame. It's always, it should be the president or vice chancellor who is responsible, but no, she or he has delegated the decision-making to a system that is governed by other people. And so if anything goes wrong, blame is always delegated downwards. So it goes down to the vice principal, it goes down to the deans, it goes down from them to the heads of department, it goes down to them, from them to the individual lecturer, it goes down from there to the individual lecturer's upbringing, their parents, their grandparents, and so on, until you eventually end up with, who the hell can I criticise here? You end up unable to criticise anybody. All of this leads to a state of affairs where we have a society that's governed by the principles of the primacy of self-interest, first of all, Secondly, the principle of economic efficiency. It used to be called value for money, getting value for money. And thirdly, unbridled competition. These become norms. And the question I want to turn to now is how they affect us in the university and in our humanities. And here I want to talk a little bit, in this section, I want to talk a little bit about how it is that we've got to the state that we're in other words, the history of our predicament and what it has led us to. I was very, very struck, just before this, I was very, very struck in preparing this talk, reading through a lot of your own government's working papers on higher education policy. And the presiding question in nearly everything that is written is the question of how Ireland is going to compete in a global environment. How Ireland is going to make sure that it's not overtaken by other nations. And that sounds kind of reasonable in one way, but competitions produce losers. Another way of saying that would be to say, our task is to make sure that the poor of the world remain poor and we gain at their expense. That's putting it in its most extreme form. But that's fundamentally what neoliberal competition is about. It's about producing losers. It's about making sure that other people fall down the league tables. In your own institution, as in mine, one of the criteria that's heading our way in order to evaluate your performance is the employability of students. So we in Warwick are being encouraged to make sure that our students go into very, very high paid jobs. In other words, we must make sure somehow there's a link between studying Milton and becoming rich. And that's ludicrous, obviously, but that is my task now. That's the task that I'm given. Because that way I will demonstrate that a Warwick student studying Milton in Warwick will do much better in the job market than somebody studying Milton in UCD, for example. In other words, I should celebrate the fact that your students do not do well. I should celebrate the fact that your students don't succeed, whereas mine do. And that's just sick and sickening, it seems to me. How that idea got into a university is beyond me. Well, it's not really. I'm just going to explain how it did. This goes back to, there's a kind of world context for this, but I want to keep it local to these islands. So I'm going to start actually with the UK, in fact. In 1974, in the UK, the miners went on strike. And the then Prime Minister Ted Heath, who's been in the news again recently, then Prime Minister Ted Heath decided to face down the miners. And he went to the country and said, we want to know who rules Britain. And the response was, not you, mate. He lost the election. And that was disastrous for the Tory party. 10 years later, there was another miners' strike in 1984. And the Tory party had learnt their lesson by this time. Margaret Thatcher had been in office for 5 years. And one thing that she was sure was going to happen was that the unions, and particularly the mining union, was going to be crushed. Why? Because one of the things that Thatcherism was about making sure there was no rival authority to the authority of the government. So she went through a whole process of attacking, for instance, the judiciary, saying that judges were corrupt, they were old-fashioned, they were out of touch with the world. Then she went to the medical profession and said, doctors, you always got a second opinion that differs from the first. Who can you trust? You certainly can't, because that was part of the attack on the national health system, which was, as it were, a communally governed system. So she attacks the law, she attacks the health system, then she turned to education, and in particular to primary and secondary education, first of all. And she said, who are these teachers? They're all pinkos, they're all lefties. They're indoctrinating your kids, and don't believe them. So she undermines the teachers, not just from political grounds, but on all sorts of grounds, and says we shouldn't really be trusting them, because the teachers wanted a bit more pay, apart from anything else, and she was determined that they wouldn't have more pay. That then moves on into the famous 1988 Education Act, which in the Higher Education Act makes sure that academic tenure is abolished, for example, and makes sure that actually the universities are now heading towards a system of privatisation. It kind of begins then. But fundamental to all of this is the idea that there will be only one source of legitimate authority in the country, and that is the government. It will not be challenged by any other institutional form in the country. And above all, any collective institution such as the trade union. What you get then, having had an attack on the law, on medicine, on education, and indeed on the university, is fundamentally an attack on knowledge itself. Don't trust these people who are in the knowledge business, is what this comes down to. Don't trust the people who are in the universities. Knowledge goes through a process then where it is reduced to information or data. If my knowledge is such that I'm too influential, in other words, if my knowledge is a knowledge from a particular engaged point of view, then it is no knowledge at all. It's not pure knowledge, says the government. To make it pure, you have to eviscerate it of any kind of persuasive activity. And the only way I can do that is to reduce it to information. Bits of information are what we now know as data. And as we all know, institutionally, fundamentally what we're engaged with now is the management of information flows. We're not really engaged in teaching or in the production of knowledge, which is based on discussion, debate, and dialogue and all that sort of stuff, and based on doubts and entertaining doubts. We're fundamentally in the process whereby I've got a bit of information. You're a student. You've got a bit of money. I'll give you the information if you give me the money. Knowledge has become something for sale, fundamentally, but only to the extent that it has been reduced from being knowledge in the first place to being mere bits of data and information. And what we're engaged in is the management of information flows. It's something you see in, as it were, the industrial production of doctoral theses, dare I say, and the industrial production, now for sale worldwide, of undergraduate essays, for example, which is it's a business, and who would question that? Well, us obviously, but it's the logic of what we are required to do ideologically. So, in all of this, you get to a state where the government is essentially in control of our institutions. And the government is essentially now in control of the university sector. Now here's where I go back to the two authors that I began with, Jasper and Julien Benda. In 1946, Jasper, who miraculously had survived living in Germany, I mean he lost his job and so on, but he survived living in Germany. He was put on the white list, as the Americans called it, at the end of the Second War, which meant that he didn't need to be purged, as it were, once Nazism was over. And he was invited to rewrite his idea of the university. But he had to rewrite it for one key reason. He had to rewrite it because the universities during the Second War in Germany had been politicized, had been Nazified. Heidegger's the case in point, obviously. And what you have in the idea of the university is something whereby Jaspers is trying to re-establish the idea of what we now call academic freedom, predicated on the idea of a completely free exploration of ideas, taking you to wherever it is that the idea will take you, without fear or favour. When he made the book, he sent it to his former student, Hannah Arendt, who at that time was living in New York. And Hannah Arendt thought this was terrific. She says, a great book. Sent him a letter saying, this is a great book. It's a great idea. But, she says, it's obviously going to be very, very expensive to have a higher education system the way that you propose it. So obviously, the state must pay for it because it's going to be so expensive. It's crucial, however, she says, that the professoriate do not become civil servants thereby. It's crucial that the professoriate maintain their distance from state intervention and state ideology. That has been completely betrayed in our time. And there are too many, in my view, too many fellow travelling people who are complicit with this. Too many people within the institutions who've gone along with the idea that actually we do the government's business. Many of them are university presidents or vice-chancellors. In a conversation that I had with one of them went along these kind of lines. I said to her, why don't you ever say no to the next government strategy that you know to be a stupid or daft strategy? To which her reply was, well, the government have been democratically elected. They represent the will of the people, and we are their servants. And I thought, that's not right. And so I said, that's not right. And she said, that means you're not democratic. And I thought, okay, you can see where this gets you to. It's as soon as you hear the will of the people, I hear the post-Nazi environment again. I hear the Nazis again, talking about the Volk, the people and the will thereof. We've got it at the moment on the other island here, the Brexit disaster that we have. The second writer who publishes again in 1946 is Julien Benda. And Benda in La Treason des Clercs made a big attack on the clerisy. He makes a distinction between people who are in civil society and people whose responsibility is to obey the dictates of thought itself, the clerks. And he says the problem with the clerks is that they become too pragmatic. They become not concerned just with the purity of their ideas. They've become engaged. This is terrible, he says. He's completely the opposite of Sartre. This is terrible, he says, because as soon as they become engaged, what they do is they begin to have their thoughts shaped by their political choices. And this, he says, leads only to one thing, which is the primacy of nationalist ideology. And within that, the primacy of an ideology that is going to lead to the competition between one nation and another, a competition that will only be resolved, he says, by war. Now, he wrote this in 1927, first of all, in the wake of the First War. And one of his big targets, paradoxically, is the nation that is Germany. He says, you can see it's the Germans that have led us astray here with all of the stuff that they do, Ever since 1813, they've been leading us astray with the idea of the nation state and the idea of the relation between the people and the nation. Whereas the French, by contrast, somehow he says, well, we're not like that. We're universal, but we're French. We're Frenchly universal. So you can see the logical contradiction in it, but you can also see the logic of the position that says, actually, this will only be resolved by another war. And sure enough, 10 years later, there is another war, predicated on certain ideas to do with the primacy of the nation state and the expansive nation state at that. Now, this seems to me to have something to do with the university itself, because there are at least two versions of the university that I think have been shaping everything that I've said so far. And the two versions that were given to us in the 1970s by the right-wing sociologist Daniel Bell. Daniel Bell, who's the kind of precursor of Francis Fukuyama, Daniel Bell argued that we'd reached the end of ideology, essentially in the 1950s. Daniel Bell argues in the 1970s that there are fundamentally only two possible models of the university. He calls them the classical model and the pragmatic model. And in the classical model, the university is that institution that, in his words, is the institution in the society endowed with the special function and the extraordinary immunity of searching for truth and evaluating the culture of the times. In this sense, the university is free to question everything in theory. It's free to question everything in theory. This is Julien Benda, again, the clerkly idea. It's the university, if you like, as the conscience of society, roaming freely over thought, but in a purely speculative manner. You can question everything in theory as long as you don't do anything about it. Okay? Your task is simply to be there as the conscience of society. That's the classical model of the university. The second model of the university is the pragmatic model. And in the pragmatic model, you get a state of affairs where the function of the university is primarily one of service in the society. Service, as he puts it, in training large numbers of persons, service in the application of knowledge, service of the members of the university in government or elsewhere. The pragmatic model. Now, in the classical model, the institution raises questions but to no historical effect. Any effect consequent upon those questions is the duty of citizens who are somehow not in the university. This is the classic idea of the university as an ivory tower. And it's something whereby we say, actually, consciousness exists separately from material fact. And you get there the beginnings of not just the atomization of the society, but the atomization of even of the human body. You're in a kind of very Cartesian mode here, where you've got the realm of thought and the realm of, I don't know, doing what your body does, wandering about, burping, making love, falling over, breaking your wrist, as I did recently, that sort of stuff. That's got nothing to do with what's going on in my head. And that seems to me to be something that leads to a state of affairs where you will get a situation of the atomization of all activity eventually. The second model, the pragmatic, leads us to a question that, okay, the university has to be in service, but who decides who's going to be serviced by the university? Who decides what it is that the university is going to serve? What is the service that the university should prioritise, and who makes that decision? So while the first model atomises society into those who think on one hand and those who do on the other, a thinking function and an operational function even within your own body, the second model, by contrast, thoroughly politicises the institution, placing it in the service essentially of those who command power in a society. In our day, government. And when your government is a government that serves the presiding ideology of neoliberalism, then the university is fully in the service of advancing neoliberal ideology. The state of affairs that we're now in is one whereby the institution, I think, and I'm going to try to put it in fairly bald terms here, our task is structurally to legitimise social and economic inequality. That is our task. We're to legitimise social and structural economic inequality. More, we are to exacerbate those inequalities. We're to make them greater and worse in the logic of competition here. Further, we have to do this in the national interest. We have to do this because Ireland has to be, as it were, in the lead in the global race, as the former Prime Minister David Cameron put it. Our task, if you like, is one where we as individuals are enjoined to serve the ideology of greed, whereby we have to encourage in students and indeed in society at large the idea that greed is good, that wealth is a marker not only of happiness but of moral goodness, and that our task really is to make sure that we legitimise the rich. And that means our task is to make sure that the rich do not pay their share of tax, fundamentally. Because that's what neoliberal ideology doesn't like. It doesn't like everybody paying tax. It especially doesn't like wealthy people paying tax. So we have a condition, I think, where education becomes something whereby we are required, I think, to produce these inequalities, to make people believe that acquisitive individualism is the moral basis on which we should govern the entirety of our social life. Okay, our present predicament, I think, combines both the classical model and the pragmatic model in Bell's thinking. We've certainly been fully politicised in the sense that we're required to service the needs of the economy in whatever ways the government of the day decides that the economy should be run. But we're also, of course, marked by this peculiar thing about the relation between excellence and equality, for example. That on the one hand, we must all be excellent, but we must all be equally excellent. It's rather like the former Education Secretary of State in the UK, Michael Gove, who said that he firmly believed that all schools in England should be above average. It's Animal Farm. It's Animal Farm come to life. All will be equal, but some will be more equal than others. let me turn from that to the specific Irish context to try to finish this here. I looked at the National Strategy for Higher Education to 2030. And this seems to me to be getting us to a state of affairs where Ireland is in danger of producing an unsavoury conclusion for higher education policies. Neoliberalism, I think, is the means whereby I most efficiently service my own greedy, acquisitive individualism, regardless of its effects upon any others. The National Strategy for Higher Education obviously does not say that. Or rather, it does not say that obviously. But actually, it's fundamentally what governs the National Strategy for Higher Education. And it's also one of the reasons why the Castle report is so, well, first of all, protracted, it seems to me, and secondly, why it's kind of hedging its bets every which way. In the National Strategy for Higher Education, we find this. We find that the higher education in Ireland, quote, has the capacity to engage more intensely than heretofore with wider society by providing intellectual leadership and authoritative opinion across a range of academic disciplines, the arts, business, and areas of public discourse. Sounds good to me, except we're engaging with wider society. Aren't we part of wider society already? That's already put us on the side of being, as it were, the classical university, because there's the wider society out there and there's us with our task here. But we're going to engage with this wider society by providing intellectual leadership and authoritative opinion. In higher education, we're told we've got lots of people who can make, quote, very valuable contributions to the community and to wider civic life. That's nice to know. These include scientists, engineers, artists, and expert practitioners in the humanities and social sciences. Don't forget humanities and social sciences. We need to ensure that the intellectual autonomy that makes such engagement possible remain in place. Again, sounds great. We're going to guarantee your autonomy. But we're going to guarantee your autonomy as long as it has the required effects and the desired effects. We're not going to guarantee your autonomy if it leads to a social revolution that overthrows the government and says, feed the poor. It's going to be good if you do what you're required to do, which is to service this notion of greedy, private, acquisitive individualism in order to make Irish people extremely wealthy and indeed more wealthy than other poor folk elsewhere. All of this, in principle, might sound fine and so far from what the strategy says, but it's already been established very early on in the strategy that higher education is at the core of a vigorous economy designed for a boost in individual wealth, through which Ireland will be competing against other nations. Research, we're told, is to be aligned with Irish national economic, social and cultural needs. Now, this is increasingly uncontroversial worldwide these days, but by God, it should be controversial. Because what it means is the government's deciding, avant la lettre, before the research has been done, what research will be valuable and what research will not. And it will fund only the research that it regards as being valuable. And given that the government is shaped by a clear political ideology, the neoliberal ideology that says you keep the poor poor, make sure the rich don't pay their taxes, then only research that actually consolidates that opinion is the research that's going to be funded. We should be saying no, it seems to me, to all of this. The objectives and operations of the institutions and those of the funding agencies will be mutually aligned, underpinned by a sustainable funding system, we are told. You're concerned, as is everybody, and by this point, when you get 3 paragraphs into these documents, and you begin to go into a kind of mind freeze because the cliches start just producing themselves and proliferating. And here they are: innovation, competitive enterprise, and continuing academic excellence is all going to be good, because Ireland must not be left behind in the global competition for talent and resources. Institutional strategies are also going to be defined and aligned with national priorities. Well, that's okay as long as you've got a benign government. But what happens when you get a shower of bastards in as your MPs? When I say when, well, what happens when you get a shower of self-seeking individuals in, corrupt people as your MPs? What happens when you get Nazis coming in? What happens when you get, as we have in England, somebody who's not even an elected MP, Nigel bloody Farage, with his neo-Nazi tendencies, his clear fascist ideology, shaping the government of the day, and the government saying that's fine? Is it not incumbent on us to say, as the conscience of society, no passaran at that moment? Is it not incumbent on us to say, no, we will not have this, this is wrong? We should go back to some fundamental principles here. And this is where I'll conclude on the idea of some fundamental principles. The strategy here in Ireland, the work plan for 2017, stresses that the sector must be, and I quote, responsive to social and economic needs. But why always respond? Given that you're supposed to be innovative, given that you're supposed to be, as it were, giving authoritative opinion, given that you're supposed to be world-leading in various ways, why do you always have to wait and respond to economic needs and economic priorities? Why not actually make some of them? In relation to this idea that we're always excellent and so on, I ask a fundamental question. When is it that the word satisfactory began to mean unsatisfactory in education circles? When is it that your performance as satisfactory meant, when you get told your teaching is satisfactory, your heart sinks because you know that means it's unsatisfactory. Why? Because it's not excellent, which is the new average. Everybody's excellent. So your task now is the logically impossible one, to exceed excellence. And what you've got to do to exceed excellence is to change the vocabulary, to become, I don't know, world leading. Then you become world making, as the University of Glasgow now is. It's a world making university. And all this inflation here, you get something that I think we should be resisting. It's an economic inflation of language that should be contested by the fundamental principles of what we should be doing. And I come back to what it is that we should be doing. Start off with the idea that education is about research. Well, research is, it seems to me, fundamentally concerned with the extending the range of what is humanly possible. In other words, research is concerned to, as it were, extend what we can do as human beings. Another word for that is freedom, it seems to me. So research, I think, is intimately tied to extending the range of freedoms, by which I don't mean market freedoms. I mean extending the range of the meanings of the word freedom to encompass more than market ideas of choice and so on. How do we do that? Well, in research, we're always concerned with judging what is true and what's false, what's good and what's bad. And those judgments there, it seems to me, are concerned with the extension of justice, getting a judgment right, getting a judgment better, getting a judgment that will serve people well. So we should be extending freedom, we should be extending justice, but we do this via discussion and debate. Because when I come up with something that I say, this is a good judgment, your task is to say, I'm not so sure about that. Maybe it's not, maybe there's a better way of looking at it. And at that point, you get an extension of democracy. That's what the university, I think, should be about the extension of human freedoms, making more people able to do more and more things, at the same time as extending the range of what is just in the world, extending the range of justice, but always also doing that in a democratic fashion in order to extend democracy. We will never have an ideal society that I began with. We'll never have a society where we have total freedom, total justice, total democracy. These things are always, as it were, in my view, about to be. These things are always to be extended, and the task of the university, I think, is to extend them. Neoliberalism has said, no, the task is to shrink these in order to make sure that the rich do not pay their taxes. And on that, I'll close. Thanks for your attention.